All right, so in class, we already took a look at documents and evidence that prove that the Maya were a complex civilization, even though they weren't a single unified empire. Today's goal is to dig a little bit deeper into their belief systems, their social structure, and institutions in order to learn how these belief systems and structures allow the rulers to gain control over their people in the city states and maintain their power over people, allowing these civilizations to function over the long term. Timeline wise, the Maya classical period is about a 700-year period you can see here on this blue line. Now, the Maya culture existed before and after this, but this is kind of their peak golden age, what we call their classical period, similar to what we saw in the classical period of the Greeks before Alexander and the Hellenistic period. Things that we've already talked about in other units that are happening at the same time as what we're talking about in classical Maya. We see the Western Roman Empire falling apart in the early part of the Maya classical period. That's all the way over in the Mediterranean Sea area. The people of the Maya don't really know about Rome, they're completely separated. You can see that Islam is founded by the Prophet Muhammad, the Sunni Shia split happens, as well as the expansion of the Islamic Caliphate is all happening during this period while the Maya are building their city states over in Central America. You can even see from our Africa unit that it's at the beginning of the Maya classical period that the kingdom of Aksum over in Africa is really peaking in power. So there's a lot going on in other parts of the world, but I just want you to have some kind of context of where we are in the overall timeline as we're zeroing in on the classical Mayan period today. So, first and foremost, what challenges and political structure shaped the Maya civilization? Well, the biggest thing you need to know is geographically is that they lived in this region called Mesoamerica, which is kind of like southern Mexico into Central America. And in particular, they lived in a region with dense rainforests, limited large rivers, and their terrain was very varied. It was mostly rainforest. Some was rocky, some it wasn't rocky. So this required a lot of adaptation, cooperation, and long term planning in order to create this civilization. Maya civilization was organized into independent city states, not a single empire, right? So these were separate cities that were sometimes allying with each other, sometimes competing with each other, sometimes fighting with each other. Each city state would have their own rulers, their own temples and traditions, and had constant competition between them. Now, despite this political competition, many of these cities did share the same religious beliefs, the same writing system, and even the same calendar system that we looked at in the in class portion of this lesson. So they were divided politically, but united culturally. So let's take a look at that next key question. What role did belief play in Mayan political power? So in Mayan society, it was their belief systems shaped how power was understood and accepted. This is a theme we keep seeing over and over again in history. The political authority of those in charge of these cities were closely linked to their religion, their rituals, and the traditions they had to perform, with power depending on these shared beliefs among all the Mayan people. So their power really didn't come from force and violence over their subjects, but instead came more from a shared sense of beliefs about why these rulers are in charge. The following examples we're about to look at show how belief helped Mayan rulers gain and maintain that power over the people inside the cities. So, why were the Maya kings both political and religious leaders? Well, like we've seen in other cultures, the Mayan rulers were believed by their subjects to have been chosen by or closely connected to the gods that they worshipped. The kings operated in what we call as intermediaries. That is, they interacted in kind of that connection between the people and the gods, and as part of this, they'd have to perform certain rituals on behalf of society to keep the gods strong and happy in order to, well, create prosperity for the people inside their city states. One of these key rituals that the powerful elites would have to perform is a bloodletting ceremony that we talked about in class. Now, all Mayans perform some level of bloodletting, where they may prick on the finger and sprinkle it on the ground as a way to feed the gods. But it was the really seen because these elites were seen as so close to the gods, their blood was seen as more potent, and thus they were required to make more sacrifices of their own blood. Here you can see even one Mayan king or ruler pulling a string with thorns through his own tongue in order to have that blood drop onto a paper that would be burned and offered to the gods. And so this is kind of the flip side, right? You're going to be in charge, and you're going to use the gods as justification for it. But since blood is such an important part of this culture, your blood is going to be seen as more powerful, and thus you are required to perform more rituals to please the gods, keep them strong, and keep the people safe and prosperous. Now, this political authority and religious authority were so closely interlinked, and ruling was seen really as a sacred responsibility of the rulers, right? This is part of their religious obligations. It's not just a political role of making laws and forcing people to follow those laws and punishing people. Really, the ruling was part of this sacred religious responsibility. So, unlike modern governments like America is supposed to be in other countries, religion and politics were not separate. Belief was the main reason that people accepted the rulers as in charge, right? It was a core part of their belief system and their political system, which is what we've seen over and over again as well. Now, the kings would use ceremonies, they'd build large monuments that we looked at, public rituals of bloodletting. All this was meant to demonstrate their connection to the divine, their connection to the gods, because after all, it's this connection to the gods that is the justification for them being in charge. So if a ruler failed to perform those rituals correctly, or those rituals were performed but prosperity did not come, this caused the people to question whether or not these kings actually were legitimate rulers. So you can see how this might create some instability in the culture if things outside the king's control tend to happen, regardless of whether or not they're performing these rituals. It's one of the weaknesses of having a belief-based legitimacy of your government. So we've already seen how religious and political powers united in Mayan culture. What I want to take a deeper look at here is how did the religious rituals of the Maya help to legitimize their rulers? That is to say, how did the rulers use a religion to justify why they were in power? As we talked about in class, bloodletting was a ritual that was considered a sacred act meant to communicate with the gods. Now, bloodletting was done by all levels of society, down to the lowest farmer or slave. They would cut themselves, sprinkle a little blood on the ground as an offering to the gods. However, the elites in Mayan society, the priests, and especially the priest kings, their blood was seen as more sacred. It was closer to the gods themselves. And so their bloodletting rituals were much more intense and much more public. So people would actually watch their rulers prove their connection to the gods in many different ways, one of which was through bloodletting. In some of these acts, they would actually have to take this rope with thorns in it, and they would have to pierce and pull through their tongue in order for the blood to flow down on a piece of sacramental paper that they would then burn as an offering to the gods. And this was done in plain view of everyone as a way to kind of show that they are doing their ritual rites necessary to keep the gods happy and healthy. It was these rituals that were believed that they would maintain the balance between the human world and the spiritual world, and this was a very important role of the political leaders and why religious power is so intertwined with them. It was their responsibility to keep this balance and keep the religious world, the world of the gods, healthy and strong through offerings of their blood. Now, successful rituals would reinforce the idea that the rulers were fit to govern. After all, why are you in charge? The gods want me in charge. How do you know? I perform these rituals and things are going well, therefore the gods want me in charge. We've seen this kind of logic in other cultures that we've studied already. So the Mayan cities themselves were actually designed to help reinforce power and belief among their people. You can see this in the design of these large plaza areas. You can see these temples, the rituals by the priests and the kings would be performed at the top so everyone could see, and they would have these large gathering spaces where crowds could gather and watch these ceremonies take place. The temples themselves were placed at the center of these cities, as you can see here, so that religion and power was visible among daily life. These were the biggest structures in the city. They were in central locations. It was designed to keep religion and political power top of mind for everyone. And because these buildings dominated public space, people were constantly surrounded by these symbols of authority, and so it was kind of hard to forget that this whole world depended on a balance between the gods and the people, and that it was their king's duty to maintain this balance. This design was meant to help remind everyone who was in charge, and that these belief systems held everyone together. The public ceremonies in particular were held in these spaces to reinforce social order and obedience. It was this constant reminder that you had to obey your rulers because your rulers were the only one keeping the spiritual and physical world in order. And if they had to deal with your rebellions, then they couldn't deal with keeping the gods healthy and happy, and thus the world would come to an end. To question the rulers was to call into question the safety of all existence. Like pretty much every society we've studied since the beginning of this class, Mayan society was highly organized in a social hierarchy. Now, they had a hierarchical system with very clear social classes. At the top was the king or high priest. Remember, these were independent cities that competed with each other. So some were ruled by priest kings. Some were just ruled by religious priests. Below them, they had a council of the priesthood made up of the royal family. Below them were the nobility, then the merchants and artisans, and below them were the farmers and the slaves of society. You'll remember in social hierarchies, the higher up you are, the more power and rights you have. The further down you are, the less power and rights you have in society are. And this could all be justified because the people at the top here are the ones responsible for keeping the world in order and keeping the gods healthy and happy. So at the very top, kings and nobles held that political and religious power. Then the priests and elites managed the rituals, the calendars, and specialized knowledge that reinforced the idea that there was this secret knowledge that those on top had, and they were using it to keep everyone safe and healthy. The farmers and laborers at the very bottom made up most of the population, and like everywhere, they produced the food, they built the cities, they really did the work of making civilization possible, while those at the top were doing the work of basically maintaining order in the minds of the population. Now, Maya complexity relied on organized labor and inequality, not equal roles. Like every culture we've been looking at, there is baked-in inequality in this culture. Now, in first semester, we saw some attempts to break out of this, demanding equality for people with the religious belief systems of Christians and Muslims. However, that's not the norm in most cultures. Now, one big way the Mayan were able to maintain political authority was their control of time. And I don't mean they could speed up time, slow down time, or time travel in any way, but the control of the Mayan calendars and astronomical observations were used to determine the timing of very important religious ceremonies. We looked at this document in class that went over this in more detail. But the priests and the rulers were able, through their scientific knowledge, to track the movements of the sun, the moon, and the planets in order to identify sacred dates that came up on the calendar. These dates were used to calculate the correct timing of rituals that they believed was necessary to ensure the favor of the gods, and being able to predict these days and then hold the ceremonies on those rightful days helped strengthen religious authority because everyone looked to the leadership going, well, they're the ones who know what days the gods want us to do these things, and so we can't overthrow them because they have knowledge that keeps the gods happy that we, the common people, do not have, and they don't want to risk upsetting the gods. Again, you see this time and time again in human species in our different societies. We combine religious power with political power, and we justify I'm in charge because the gods want me in charge, so to challenge me is to challenge the gods. And that doesn't go well for anyone. All of this was reinforced by the ability to predict events such as eclipses or other significant celestial cycles. Reinforces this idea that they had some special knowledge, right? Think about this. The priests and kings were able, through this specialized scientific knowledge, to predict exactly when the sun was going to be covered up by the moon, darkening the sky during the middle of the day. For those who don't understand how astronomy works, this can be a terrifying moment, believing that an age of darkness is coming or that the sun will disappear forever. And so to be able to accurately predict these things shows that you understand how the gods are working, which means the days you're saying to perform these rituals must be the accurate ones, because after all, you can predict things like eclipses coming. This is a very powerful way of keeping control. This knowledge increased their political power over the common people by convincing everyone that the rulers were divinely favored, that is, favored by the gods, and had these unique qualifications to lead them because they had this knowledge of how the gods work. And by controlling the calendar, they would also influence when people worked, when they rested, when tribute was paid, and when people would participate in ceremonies. So it's through this they were able to have complete control, essentially, over the lives of the people and their cultures. And this is not unique to the Maya. We see cultures do this all over the world that we've studied. Alright, so now let's take a look at how the Maya systems of power lasted across generations, even though they didn't have a single unified empire. Remember, the Maya was not a Mayan empire. It was a bunch of different Mayan city-states they were constantly competing with, sometimes working with, sometimes fighting with, sometimes creating alliances with each other. So these systems of power and belief were institutional. That means they didn't depend on a single ruler. Instead, it depended on people having specialized knowledge they could use to control people. This religious knowledge, the rituals and calendars, were passed down across generations from one group of the one group who knows what's going on to the next. And in this way, they were able to kind of keep control over long periods of time. The cities and temples were built, expanded, and rebuilt over long periods of time, showing that they weren't just concerned with the here and now, but they were concerned about projecting power and the power of their civilizations forward into time, well beyond the existence of a single life. And their society was organized again into these independent city-states, not a single empire. This is what makes them different from the other cultures that we'll be studying in this unit, the Mexica or Aztec as people call them, the Inca, or even the North American societies we studied on the first day of this unit. In many ways, you could probably make the comparison to they existed in a similar state to the way the Greek city-states existed prior to Alexander's father conquering them and uniting them into a single empire, right? There are parallels here. It's not a perfect example, but there are parallels. So even while they competed with one another, these cities relied on shared traditions and institutions that outlasted individual leaders, allowing for their culture to basically be fairly stable for a long period of time that outlasted any single group of people. And this all relied on control of specialized knowledge that could link religious power and political power. Okay, so hopefully you have at least some understanding of how Mayan rulers used the institutions of Mayan civilization, their beliefs, social hierarchies, to keep control of people and maintain that control and stability over long periods of time. So what I'd like you to do is rewrite today's goal from the top of the note sheet or the beginning of the video. Then, in sentences, complete thoughts, identify 3 important things that you learned from this video that helps you understand how they maintain control. And then finally, write at least one question you still have that can help you better understand Maya civilization. As always, this is how you not just memorize information, but you remember, you understand it, you integrate it into your memory so that you can better perform on the assessments. If you have any questions, 1, write that question down, and 2, always reach out. Until then, I'll see you next class.